This video was brought to you in part by the channel MTG Anarchy, where we take a look into the world of Magic the Gathering and throw a little bit of mischief and chaos into the mix. I have issues with the mechanic of Hexproof. Welcome to Mechanic Issues, where we sit down and discuss some issues with a lot of the mechanics within the world of Magic the Gathering. My name is Michael, it is great to see you here. For those that are new to this mechanic or do not know this mechanic, Hexproof is a static ability that means this permanent, or you, cannot be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. An example of this would be Sacred Wolf. A wolf creature that costs 2 and a green, has power and toughness of a 3/1, and has this mechanic included. This mechanic was introduced to replace an older mechanic, Shroud, for those of you that also do not know about this mechanic, was a static ability that means this permanent or player can't be the target of spells or abilities. An example of this mechanic would be Miss Leopard, a cat creature that costs 3 and a green, has a power and toughness of 3/2, and has this ability. To really understand why I have issues with this mechanic, let's imagine that you're a new player to the game of Magic the Gathering. You're building your deck to how you want to play it, and you see a couple of creature cards with the Hexproof ability that you feel would go well with your deck. In your mind, you're thinking, I'm not going to be affected by spells and abilities my opponent's casting control. That's actually a very powerful ability. Why aren't others talking about and using more cards like this? Once you have your deck built, either online, on Arena, or on paper, you decide to try out the deck, whether it's online or even, if you're lucky in today's day and age, in your local game store, just to play a couple of games. After facing off against multiple opponents, not having any issues, you get to that control type player, the ones who have answers to everything. You're playing against this player, you have multiple creature permanents on the board, those creatures have hexproof, you feel great about your board state. Then, your opponent casts and plays the board wipe spell, Wrath of God. At this point in time, you're probably thinking to yourself, why did he play that spell? It just gets rid of his creatures and not mine. That was actually a dumb spell to play. Then you find out, after a judge was called, or the spell connects online, that your creatures were affected by the spell, because Wrath of God doesn't target any of your creatures, but affects all creatures on the battlefield in general, destroying each of your creatures, leaving you unprotected and having the control player win. As a new player, you would feel frustrated by this, because you as the new player expect the ability to work in a straightforward fashion. But instead, it's not so simple of a mechanic. Others may disagree with this thought process, saying it's simple to understand, yet in the viewpoint of a new or returning player, unless giving or remembering this information beforehand, you will become frustrated because the mechanic does not go the way you expected it to. I understand that this was a long example, but this is the frustration with this mechanic. Even though the ability specifically states that you and or permanents you control cannot be the targets of spells or abilities your opponents control, the issue lies with the phrase target, as it is a loophole that your opponents can use to affect those permanents you control with the hexproof mechanic. I understand Wizards of the Coast may have designed this mechanic this way in hopes to not make this mechanic too powerful, but let's compare this mechanic to another mechanic that has a, how you say, Indestructible present. Yeah, the mechanic's Indestructible. Indestructible is a static ability that states, effects that say destroy, do not destroy this. An annoying example of a card with this ability would be Avacyn, Angel of Hope. For those that do not know this card, it is a legendary angel that costs 5 and 3 white mana to cast, has a power and toughness of 8/8, and has the following abilities of Flying, Vigilance, and Indestructible, and has the additional ability of other permanents you control have Indestructible. For those of us who have played against this card and are groaning at this moment, know that this is one of the most annoying cards to play against. Not only does this card have Indestructible, but it also gives other permanents Indestructible as well. The ways to get rid of this card are by having it sacrificed, countered against when cast, having the Indestructible ability lost, bounced, or exiled from the battlefield. Those are the only ways to get rid of this card. Yet the ability of Indestructible is straightforward, as it cannot be destroyed by lethal damage or cards that say destroyed, whether targeted or by a board wipe effect. It does not have that loophole that Hexproof seems to have. Players that may be new or returning understand from the get-go of what Indestructible means and does, while on the other hand, other knowledge is required to understand Hexproof, making it a confusing mechanic. But why does Hexproof have to be confusing? Why can't it be straightforward? There are quite a few reasons as to why this mechanic cannot be straightforward, as one of those reasons has to do with the players themselves. In reality, the human race is very complicated to understand, as we are not simple in the slightest. We have many qualities, emotions, ideas, ideals, beliefs. All of this and more makes us who we are as humans. Combine that with one of the most complex games ever created, Magic the Gathering, and you get many issues that occur. We as individuals say we want to make something simplistic, yet by default end up making things more difficult than they have to be. Aside from this, we also try to make opportunities for ourselves that end up giving an advantage to ourselves that we can abuse for our benefit, while trying to screw over those that also try to take advantage of what they are given. This statement is a confusing statement, but let's compare this to the following. There are many within the Magic community that say Indestructible is a fair mechanic because it gives players an advantage while still having a way with dealing with the mechanic. You can still get rid of permanents that have Indestructible with the earlier examples that I provided. Now, let's compare this to the Hexproof mechanic. Currently, you can get rid of permanents with Hexproof by dealing damage to said permanent, destroying the permanent, sacking the permanent, removing the Hexproof effect, or having it be affected by a board state effect that doesn't target said permanent. But what would happen if Wizards decided to change the mechanic rule from this permanent can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control to this permanent can't be affected by spells or abilities your opponents control? Yes, it would be straightforward for players to understand this mechanic, but you would have a group of players, whether the minority or the majority, doesn't matter which, come out with their pitchforks saying that the mechanic is now unfair because it's not as easy as it once was to get rid of permanents that have this mechanic. Although the underlying meaning of this is that you just took away an advantage that people once had, and people do not like it when you change something they were already used to. On the other hand, if Indestructible was created, or at this point changed, that it could be affected by board wipes, the Magic community would also be up in arms because you took away an advantage that players once had, but again, this is one of many reasons. Another reason as to why a straightforward change to this mechanic would be an issue, from my point of view, is that to change the mechanic now is to make current and longtime players have to relearn and understand this mechanic once again. And although there may be a good amount of players that are fine with this change, there are more players out there that would rather be stubborn and go by the old rules over the new ones. Like I stated earlier, people do not like change, and when you change an already known mechanic that people are used to, there are people that do not like that sort of thing. But one of the biggest reasons as to why this mechanic cannot be straightforward to many, and this is something that I can hear people complain in the comments section of this video, or on Reddit, or wherever, is because of the power level of this mechanic. I currently rate the power level of this mechanic as a 4 to a 5, a mechanic that is irritating to some, but can still be dealt with. If this mechanic was changed to what I suggested earlier, I would guess that the power level of this mechanic would range from a 7 to an 8, maybe even a 9, although I highly doubt a power level of 9, as yet it would be harder to get rid of, but it's still doable to do so. Concerns that I can see this being at those levels are that many would say that by changing the mechanic to what I mentioned earlier would not only make games unplayable, but also format breaking for multi-card formats such as Standard, Modern, Legacy, Vintage, and so forth. Again, in my opinion, I don't believe a change like this would have this effect, but we would still hear about it. But when it comes down to it, a mechanic like Hexproof can be confusing to many who are just starting or returning to this game, even to those who have been playing for a while and forgotten the rules of the mechanic. And yes, while it is fine to learn about mechanics if you do not understand the mechanic after the fact, why not make it simple from the beginning, when you want to get players interested in this game of Magic the Gathering? This game is already as complex as it is, yet it can be simplified. By changing the Hexproof mechanic to this permanent can't be affected by spells or abilities your opponents control, you not only make it easier for players to understand, but in my own personal opinion, it can make games more interesting by having to figure out how to get around hexproof, which is something that we have to do already for the mechanic Indestructible, and to make opportunities for more creative card designs. In terms of creative card designs, as well as getting around mechanics like this, would be the card Shadow Spear. Shadow Spear is a 1-drop legendary artifact equipment that has the following abilities. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has trample and lifelink. For 1 mana, permanents your opponent's control lose hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, and you can equip it for 2 mana. Not only is this an interesting card that sees play, it is a solution to issues people already have with hexproof and indestructible. Not only this, with the creation of similar cards that can do abilities like this, issues like hexproof would be more viable to deal with in the future. At the end of it all, it is in my opinion that a rule change needs to happen for the mechanic of hexproof, as not only would it make it simpler for players to understand this mechanic, but would allow more creative and interesting ways for not only deck creation, but card creation as well. And although in the short term there will be individuals against this change, my belief is to the betterment of the Magic players, the Magic community, and to the game of Magic the Gathering in itself. And it is in this belief that this is a change that needs to happen. But these are just my opinions. What are yours? Let me know in the comments down below what you think about this topic and why. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoyed this video here on the channel of MTG Anarchy. Before you go, I would actually appreciate it if you could like and share this video so it gets out into the algorithm so more people within the Magic the Gathering community can actually see these types of videos. Also, if you haven't done so, or this is your first time on the channel, I would personally appreciate it if you could go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell notification so you can keep up to date with any new videos that do come out here on the channel of MTG Anarchy. And finally, I would personally appreciate it if you can go and support your local game stores, your LGSs, as long as you're financially stable, because we are all one community and we should all support the places that we want to go back to when everything is done and over with the pandemics and everything. So again, if you're financially stable, please support your local game stores. But with that said, this is Michael here on the channel of MTG Anarchy. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your time, and I will see you guys all again soon. Thanks again.